Good morning, everyone. My name is Jennifer. I am Jennifer Troina. I'm a postdoc here at the Institute for the Oceans and Fisheries in the Pelagic Ecosystems Lab. We would like to begin by acknowledging that the land on which the Institute for the Oceans and Fisheries is broadcasting the seminar from is the ancestral and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. You may be joining us from ancestral lands across British Columbia, Canada, and the world, and we would like to acknowledge the owners and caretakers of those lands as well. So it's my pleasure to introduce you our speaker today, Dr. Ferguson. Dr. Ferguson is a lead scientist in his field. He's been a marine mammal research scientist with Fisheries and Oceans Canada, based in Winnipeg, since 2002. His currently research investigates ice seals and ice whales, and his interest in marine mammal ecology and life history evolution has resulted in over 300 publications. Steve did his undergrad at Guelph University, his master's on caribou at University of Victoria, and his PhD on polar bears at the University of Saskatchewan. He was a postdoc fellow at Lakehead University, and he holds adjunct status at the University of Manitoba, where he supervised graduate students. Welcome, Steve. I'll hand it to you.
Thank you, Jen. So I'm going to talk about Arctic marine mammals, but in a context of global warming. And maybe what I'll do is start off and give you my theme of the talk. In case anybody has to run, you'll know the key message. And the idea here is that we've been spending a lot of time monitoring changes due to global warming in marine ecosystems and everywhere else. And we really have started this maybe to convince people that it's important, but I think at this stage maybe it's obvious. And I'm suggesting here that we need to go a little further in our scientific research. For example, with predicting the future and providing mitigation strategies, and actually some people are actually suggesting that we go one step further and start working on adaptation strategies. Here we're accepting that global warming's is occurring, will get worse, and we need to, as scientists, provide the information necessary so that people can adapt to those changes. So just a brief history here. I used to study caribou, as Jen had mentioned, and I did aerial surveys across Canada and Alaska, thousands of hours flying planes and trying to estimate abundance of caribou. And at that time, caribou numbers were declining in a circumpolar right around the Arctic. And we thought and considered that it was likely global warming was the cause. In the 90s, I sort of entered the marine world without actually realizing it, but studying polar bears. And again, we were able to document changes over time, showing that the denning areas of polar bears was shifting north, and the entrance time for shelters was being delayed due to global warming, or that's what we attributed it to. And then in the 2000s, when I started working as a stock assessment research scientist with Fisheries and Oceans, we started to look at populations, and sort of the goal was to determine how many animals there were and what's a sustainable number that could be hunted or killed. The emphasis was on populations or stocks, but I think really we did have a bit of an ecosystem approach that's being developed more and more over time. We still had to look at the body condition of the animals and what kind of disease or parasites they had. We had to consider fishing and oil and gas, different human activities. We had to look at the habitat, the sea ice, and the climate. You had to know a bit about the predators of those prey animals, as well as their food and possible competition, and things like mating system, movements were all important. So this ecosystem approach has become more and more common, and it's sort of grown in scale, but I think it was something we always had to do. In addition, we've had to work in a circumpolar fashion with all the Arctic countries around the world, and trying to collaborate in ways that can bring our knowledge into a bigger scale. Again, if we're considering global warming, this is important to think about. And then we also have used indigenous knowledge. The Inuit have provided help throughout my career, initially maybe more for advice and keeping me alive in the field. But I think more recently we've started to develop collaborations where they're more active participants. And in fact, there's a couple of examples of where they've taken over the science and the research and are able to ask the kinds of questions that are important to them. We did this in the Belcher Islands in Hudson Bay when we tagged seals for about 8 years. In the last 2 years, the local Inuit took over the whole field project, capturing the seals, gluing the tags on, taking the body measurements and samples. And then also an example here during COVID when we weren't allowed to work up or to travel up north, we passed on the request to our Inuit collaborators to do the work in our absence. And they've been able to continue the same work going forward. Something I'm particularly proud of is the community-based monitoring, where we get the help of hunters from local communities to provide samples from their hunts that we can archive here in Winnipeg, and they can be used for various purposes. This program kind of died about the time that I arrived with DFO, but since then, with the help of a lot of people and a lot of work trying to gain the trust of communities, we've been able to expand it to the majority of communities in the Canadian Arctic, including all 4 territories. And I think this creates an amazing archive of tissue samples, and it covers periods of time over many decades. Probably some samples are back in the 1970s, and thousands of different species and sampled tissues from various organs, including even different seasonal samples collected that can answer a lot of different questions and can be put to use again, not only for monitoring and to show that things are changing with global warming, but also can be used in a predictive fashion to look into the future. And having this huge geographic coverage that we are lucky in the Canadian Arctic to have, we can also ask some bigger ecological questions related to theoretical things like the demographic regulation of populations, how it might occur along a latitudinal gradient or going from core areas of geographical distribution to the edges of an animal's geographical distribution, like what is controlling these populations. And this will bring us to an idea of mechanisms of population number changes and other demographic parameters. And an example would be for the ring seals, where we found that the core area where the ring seals evolved was fairly high latitudes, and this is being represented here by this orangey brown colored seal. We think this is where they're best adapted, because this is probably what the kind of environment that they evolved and have the life history and morphological and physiological adaptations to. But like any species, it does have a limit to its geographic range. And then the southern limit for these seals, here represented by the blue seal, we can see that the processes are different. And if we look at these processes and investigate them, then we'll get a better idea of what might be the mechanisms for change as we start to have these shifts in geographic distribution. And if you look at the top 2 graphs, there's the blood barrier depth is being used as a condition indice, a body condition. And if we look at environmental variables on the x-axis, we can see that the seals from the two regions are responding differently to the environment. In the high Arctic, where they are we're arguing are well adapted, if you get an earlier spring or a longer open water period when they can feed more and put on body fat, that's good for them. That happens occasionally. In contrast, at the limits of their distribution, the opposite occurs, where if you get too early a spring or too long an open water period, the seals aren't well adapted to these situations and their body condition is actually declines. And you can see in the bottom right another example here showing that the blubber depth varies over months of the year, extreme differences with the southern peripheral populations, whereas we consider more well-adapted high Arctic populations have less body condition changes seasonally. And we see more evidence of these differences between the two regions. The body size, they're larger seals in the high latitudes. They grow slowly, they reproduce later, and their body condition is less variable. And they also move more, greater dispersal. And so just showing a little more in-depth view of the changes in body condition relative to these two areas, the seals in the core area in the left column, and then the seals in the periphery in the right column, and then the rows are pups in the top, then juveniles, and then adults. And you can see that the core seals don't vary that much in body condition over seasons, which we argue would be an indication of being well adapted. And these are sine waves that have been applied to the data, and you can use statistical methods to then contrast the phase or the amplitude of the period. And if we look at the peripheral seals at the edge of their geographic distribution, you see these very large cycles in body conditions seasonally. And in particular, the adults are going from extremely fat seals because they have a long open water period and good feeding, down to a body condition that's probably putting them at energetic danger levels in the wintertime. And there's also some concerns that even with that excess body fat, if the waters are warm, that these seals could suffer from hyperthermia. In addition, they're moving more in the core areas, particularly the juveniles. The juvenile seals are moving over 2,000 kilometers each summer. The adults are more stationary because they're primed to habitat related to reproduction. But if you look at the southern seals in around Hudson Bay, in this case, their movements are a lot less noticeable. So also, I mentioned the sexual maturity of the core seals is delayed, or at least later than the peripheral seals. The interbirth interval is almost 2 years rather than popping every year, which we would expect from ring seals. They live longer too, and this kind of a life history strategy has been called bet hedging. So they invest more in the adult survival, live longer, sample a lot of years, different reproductive bouts, and they do this with less investment in their offspring because they usually don't survive. They usually come upon in high latitude environments. It's often unpredictable, and mortality is common. Therefore, the strategy is to spread your reproductive investments over a long period of time, and hopefully you'll, by luck, just get a couple of good seasons. And the same can be found with beluga whales. Here again, the orangey brown is the high Arctic beluga whales, and the blue is the southern whales in Hudson Bay. And we found similar differences with a delay in or a longer period before sexual maturity for females in the high Arctic. And also with the whales, we can look at the ovary and count the corpora and get an idea of lifetime reproductive success. And we can see that the high Arctic, again, is better adapted to their environment. And these are some suggestions here then of what the mechanisms of some of these changes will be. How do we expect these southern populations to start to have problems? What's the demographic response? And that helps with the predictions into the future and eventually some strategies for adaptation. We can do this in bowhead whales as well, although it's slightly different. Here we're doing longitudinal studies as we sample along the baleen plate. So the baleen of bowhead whales is longer than any other mystocyte and has decades of information available to be sampled along its chronological length. And here's a female showing that the corticosteroid and progesterone peaks indicating calving events happens fairly regularly during this period for the female, about 4.4 year interval. And we can then compare this kind of a reproductive pattern over different time periods, once again, to get an idea of the mechanisms of how the reproduction will change in the future. Some other considerations relative to the ecosystem approaches to get an idea of predation and how the different species respond to that and helps us in predicting future outcomes. An example here is looking at the species diversity across the world. And in the top right, we got the pinnipeds and both the phocids and otariids, their species richness relative to latitude along the x-axis. And you can see that it's bimodal with a lot of seal species occurring in temperate waters. And actually, there's pretty good diversity in high latitudes, even though the productivity doesn't allow for a lot of different species, but very few seal species in the equatorial regions. Conversely, if you look at sharks, the pattern's the opposite, and they do better partly because they're somewhat cold-blooded, but also it's what they're adapted to is the much greater species richness in mid-latitudes and equatorial regions. And we also argue here that the pattern that we see with the seals is due to shark predation. With killer whales, they're being observed more in the Canadian Arctic. The sightings have been increasing, but then we're not sure if this is due to greater effort. There's more people living in the Arctic, and they have better equipment and can travel further with better boats. But when we looked at the sighting data, we did see evidence that the killer whales are arriving earlier and leaving later, giving them a much longer period of time when it's ice-free, and they can predate the different endemic Arctic whales and seals. And not only do they eat the different Arctic marine mammals, but they also cause them to shift their habitat use and limit perhaps their foraging activities. This is an animation here showing what happens with killer whales entering into the eastern Canadian Arctic. The big yellow blob in the middle here is Baffin Island, and the colorful orangey yellow blue stuff is ice. And then we're going to see the bowhead whales that are tagged in Fox Basin, and then eventually killer whales that are tagged up in Eclipse Sound and Metametallic area. I'll start this, and you can see the dots there. That's the bowhead whales, and they're spending time in this Prince Regent Inlet area, doing a lot of feeding. And I'll just pause it here. And then the white dots up in the right-hand corner of Baffin Island are the killer whales, a group of about 20 of them that have just moved from Eclipse Sound into Admiralty Inlet. And I'll continue it to see as they move through Lancaster Sound and into the same area that the bowhead whales are occurring in. And let's see, I just pause it here. Now you can see once the killer whales are in the area, the bowhead whale reaction is quite extreme. They head into the ice or very close to the shoreline. And it's fascinating that they somehow are able to detect each other, I think, over large distances. And it's a bit of a mystery as how this can happen. Now, once the killer whales are done, they quickly move out of the area. And you can see once they've moved out, the sea ice starts to grow. So they seem to be experienced enough to know when to leave and avoid getting trapped in the sea ice. The sea ice doesn't bother the bowhead whales, though they continue to work and feed through the sea ice. Eventually, they'll move through Fear and Hecla and back out towards Hudson Strait, whereas the killer whales will move out into the North Atlantic. But this kind of a pattern is something that's going to affect the bowhead whales. They're probably making trade-offs or compromises relative to their feeding behavior to minimize that predation risk. So back to that question about the killer whales and whether the sightings have increased. Has the actual numbers increased? Well, we do now have enough photo ID information to show that there is probably an increase in killer whales that have been going into the Arctic, and about a 2% growth rate per year. Doesn't sound like much, but these large whales don't have a large growth rate anyways. And there's probably in the high Arctic, that area that we just saw in Lancaster Sound, Baffin Island, is probably about just over 200 killer whales. And now we have evidence that there's at least two killer whale ecotypes. On the far left, you can see the genetics is showing this number one group is what I also refer to as the high Arctic killer whales. And then the number two group over here is the low Arctic killer whales. And the diet is different, looking at compound-specific stable isotopes. It looks like the low Arctic whales might be eating seals and fish, whereas the high Arctic killer whales seem to have a diet focused on other whales. And the distribution is different as well. And we can see that there's some evidence of looking at the sighting data that would suggest that their density-dependent regulation may be different between the low Arctic and the high Arctic killer whales, which is interesting, but it would require a bit more data to be able to show something significant going on there. If we look at the globe on the left, you can see that the dotted line is one of the telemetry tagged killer whales went out into the middle of the North Atlantic Ocean, close to the Azores. And this is the kind of migratory movement we think a lot of these oceanic killer whales are making from the middle of the North Atlantic up into the Arctic. And in contrast, the low Arctic killer whales are probably moving more of an east-west because they seem, at least genetically, to be linked from Hudson Bay through Greenland, Iceland, and Norway. Now I'll talk a bit about some of the human interactions, because we can't really predict the future or provide adaptive strategies for people living in the North without knowing how they have to contend with the human development and interactions. And I'll start off with a quick bowhead whale story. In the Northwest Atlantic, the Eastern Canada, West Greenland killer bowhead whale population was commercially hunted and brought down to almost, well, certainly to economic extinction. Almost, there's only hundreds of whales left in the early 1900s, and they've started to recover, but there seems to be a plateauing in numbers. And it's actually interesting because the numbers seem to be about half of what the pre-commercial whaling carrying capacity was. And we think this might have to do with the severity of commercial whaling. So there's three arenas here that have bowhead whales and where commercial whaling was significant. The first one of the yellow dots or dashes here is the Northeast Atlantic. And they were the first population to have a strong commercial whaling because it's close to Europe. And it started over many centuries. And that population really hasn't increased that much at all. It's still quite small. The next area that was hit with commercial whaling was the Northwest Atlantic, that Eastern Canada, West Greenland population. We just looked at it. And it was also commercially harvested for a number of centuries. And as we mentioned, it started to regrow or rebound in numbers, but it's still nowhere near where it used to be. The third and final area that was whaled is in the Pacific, and it was hit hard as well, although, and this is when the factory vessels were available. It was a much shorter period of time, but it was still intense. But that population apparently has rebounded to near pre-commercial whaling carrying capacity numbers. So it seems to be an indication of not only how hard you're hit with mortality, but also the intensity. How long did it last? And there's some evidence now, there's some genetic markers that show the differences between these whale populations relative to that intensity of commercial whaling. Ship traffic, bowhead whales, their close cousins are right whales, and right whales, at least in some areas or most areas, I guess, really are in trouble. The North Atlantic right whale is one of the most endangered species, as is the Pacific. And we think over time, ship strikes has been a major cause of that. So I think we have to be on the watch for bowhead whales, that likely something similar is going to happen. There's the iron ore mine in Baffin Island that has large ice or large iron ore carriers. And bowhead whales tend to, at least in the summer, sometimes do surface feeding, and they're not very observant of what's going on, and can be struck. And there are some overlaps here with ship traffic and where the bowhead whale concentrates relative to what our telemetry has shown us. Another important aspect of human interactions is the fisheries, and this is in Baffin Bay, the turbot fishery, and you can see that there's a couple of species here that are important with interacting with the fisheries. The sperm whales at the top and northern bottlenose, the next row, and this is from telemetry data showing their diving behavior over time. Both of these species are seen from the fishing vessels. The at-sea observers record them both. If you're a research vessel attending this activity, you see both species, so it's kind of assumed that they're doing something similar relative to depredation or risk of entanglement. But once you look at the actual dive data at the top row here, again with the sperm whales, the blue and purple is showing the proximity to fishing vessels, and the sperm whales are commonly associated with fishing vessels, and they're capable of quite deep dives, but they don't seem to be doing it. In contrast, when you look at the bottlenose whale in the next row, you see that they're less commonly associated with the fisheries vessels, and they're making deep dives and probably making more natural feeding explorations. So just what we see from the fishing vessels doesn't give us the same kind of ecological understanding of what the whale species are actually doing. This is a little video kind of showing that the research vessel here, the black square, and it's just tagged sperm whale, which is the blue circle. And you can see the blue circle right away goes over to a triangle, and that's a fishing vessel. And the sperm whale will follow the fishing vessel. So you get an idea how these sperm whales really like the fishing vessels. They're getting a lot of something out of that activity. And then they leave one, they immediately go to another. And this sperm whale stays with the fishing vessels throughout this time period, which is interesting, but it's also interesting to see how many fishing vessels there are in this relatively small area. We don't usually think of the Arctic as being fished, but there's a lot of fishing going on, and that, of course, results in potential for interactions with the whale species and possible entanglements and bycatch, things like that. So my case here is that we've done a lot of monitoring. We've shown a lot of the changes that have occurred due to global warming. But now I think we need to provide predictions into the future and some information that's going to help people to adapt. And here's an example of a study that's just been published. And on the lower left, you see a graph. That's the red bar is showing the time as time goes on. The dashed line in the middle here is the current time. And so we have historical as well as future predictions of, in this case, bearded seal modeling, or bearded seal habitat. We did it for ring seals as well, too. And the concentric circles here are the core areas center of where the seal's best habitat is in these three different domains. So if you look in the central or eastern Canadian Arctic, you can see the circles go north. Not a surprise as we lose sea ice, and we match this to key life history features of the seals and to make sure we get the right environmental features. But these bearded seal habitat is going to become very poor in Hudson Bay, whereas right now it's quite good, and they're going to move north probably. That's the predictions. Of interest, though, is in the west. The Bering Chukchi Sea has been prime bearded seal habitat, and here it's moving east, once again into the Canadian Arctic archipelago. And then there's also an east side of Greenland is moving north. This is the kind of research we need to help tell the communities in the Arctic what to expect going forward into the future and allow them to adapt. And this dashed green line here is the last ice area. This is where we expect most of the endemic Arctic marine mammals to end up as we continue to lose sea ice. Interestingly, we look at right now, more than 80% of all the bowhead whales in the world come into this Canadian Arctic archipelago with their calves to nurse. Over 90% of the narwhal in the world come into the archipelago with their calves to nurse. And then almost all of the world's bowhead whales come into this area with their calves to nurse and provide some kind of safe haven for them. So this is amazing as far as our research potential goes to be Canadians and doing research in this country. But it's also an immense responsibility because the whole world is going to be looking to us to see whether we can bring these animals into the next century. Now, there's three ways that the temperate species, as their range expands and moves north, three ways they can get into the Arctic and maybe get into those calving areas of beluga, narwhal, and bowhead. One is through the Fram Strait, another is through the Bering Strait, and the third is this one, through the Labrador Sea, Davis Strait, Baffin Bay. And I think this is the most important one, because what we've learned of the killer whales is this is the way to get into those calving areas. And either in the case of killer whales, you can kill and eat them, or if you're a competitor, you can sort of take over their territory. And so we want to monitor this particular migration route to find out how it's will play out into the future. And again, the reason we want to know some predictions of the future is that we need to understand how it's going to change. Knowing that the geographic distribution is going to shift towards the poles is helpful, but there's a lot that's going to happen in between. And in particular, if there is some mitigation opportunities, we need to know what the demographic response is and how things are likely to unfold. One way we can do this is to look at guilds of animals that are in certain types. Like here we look at whales. We can look at whales and see their different life history strategies and try to compare and get an idea of who's going to win and who's going to lose. But we did this with seals, here with ring seals, bearded seals, harbor seals, and harp seals, and looked at a number of their life history features and some indices of their foraging and the way they interact with the environment to try to understand how they currently exist and how they might exist in the future. And interestingly here, when we look at how their body condition varies over time, we see this same sine wave cycle for ring seals that we saw earlier, but it's almost identical to what harp seals have, which would suggest that if harp seals don't need sea ice as badly as ring seals, that maybe they would be a good one to move into those areas. Bearded seals don't show much of a seasonal variation. They seem really well adapted to the benthic foraging, and they can do that in the winter, summer, spring, fall. Harbor seals are a bit more unique, a little different, and they can do reasonably well with ice, but not that well. We look at where the carbon is derived from as to what these species are eating. The ringed and bearded seals the largest proportion of their carbon comes from sympagic food webs. So this is the ice-associated food webs. In contrast, the harbor and harp seals, most of their carbon comes from the pelagic open water phytoplankton blooms. And we can compare a number of life history features to show how these seals differ, and once again try to make some predictions as to who's going to win, who's going to lose in this climate change battle. We can open it up to look at seals right around the world and assess their different life history strategies relative to key environmental traits like the amount of energy or primary productivity of the environment, and what's the kind of spatial and temporal variation of that distribution of that energy. And we come up with these high latitude seals here, again represented in the blue in the top left corner. Those are the bet hedgers. So those seals, again, live long, invest a lot in adult survival. The trade-off is to reduce their investment in juveniles and their progeny. And we can do this again with other gills. In this case, what we've done with odontocetes, so the toothed whales, and looked at how they respond to their environments by evolving specific kinds of life histories. So when they give birth, how long they live, how long between birth bouts, age of sexual maturity, those kind of things. And once again, even with the whales, we're still finding there's a group of bet hedgers. It includes whale species like the beluga whale and the narwhal that seem to have this trade-off in the adult and juvenile survival. This is helpful, again, I think, to predict some of the future outcomes and consequences of global warming. And I want to emphasize one more time to encourage that there's a circumpolar collaborations, that the different countries that have a responsibility in the Arctic work together. And I'll just, at the end here, just kind of throw out some crazy ideas, some arm waving to show you what I mean when I talk about going from monitoring to mitigation to adaptation. There's going to be new species, and sometimes new species are called invasives and are considered bad. I think we have to start to shift that thinking and consider the ecosystem and think about the new species relative to the resilience of that ecosystem. So it's not that new species are bad and we have to somehow stop them from coming into an area. This goes back to adaptation. They're going to come anyways. So let's try to think about, is it going to work? Do we have to make any mitigations to allow the new ecosystem to thrive and be useful? And it's going to be a turnover. We're not going to be able to stop what's happening with global warming at this stage. Some sort of tricky questions, something like Hudson Bay with the polar bears. Do we want these bears who are likely on their way out to die of starvation and disease, or would we maybe want to increase the quota and allow Inuit to hunt them? Some of the top predators, like the killer whales, do we want to use birth control to reduce their population growth so that their impact is ameliorated, at least in the short term? Possibly culling some seals and things could be considered. But important, I think, as far as adaptation goes, is maybe we talk to northerners and try to give them a better idea of what's coming towards them, and help them maybe transition their harvesting strategies from the endemic Arctic whales maybe to some of the new temperate species. Just some ideas that we need to consider. And that is it. Thank you. I'd welcome any questions.
I really enjoyed your talk. I have two questions, but I'll start with one and then give a chance to someone else. So I was really interested in your whole idea of having species that are bed hedging and or at least subpopulation that are bed hedging and those that are not. And I was wondering, have you looked into what that would mean for population dynamics? Because I'm guessing then if they're bed hedging, the variability in reproduction is changing a fair bit, and that might change how population are growing. So have you looked into this?
Thanks, Brie. That's yeah, how would I answer that? It's something I think about. I don't think we've necessarily studied it, but I think it's going to be interesting because it does affect the management and conservation to consider these things. For example, we might want to put more emphasis on adult survival and not and less so on the pups or the juveniles that are likely to die anyways. So you can maybe, in the case of hunting and management, just shift the mortality to the young and try to allow older reproductive females to have a longer life. But it's got to have, I think, consequences in a demographic sense in a bigger way. Yeah, it's something I'll have to think more about. If you got the answer, help me out.
I do not have the answer. Thank you.
Andrew?
Yeah, hi, Steve. I also really enjoyed your talk, and I was curious to know more about what's going on the other side of the Arctic in Russia. I don't know to what extent you've got collaborations, and I'm wondering, as things open up, what it means in terms of gene flow between the areas, and increased opportunities for either Canadian-born species or Russian-born. Can you give us some insights into what's going on around the entire Arctic?
Yeah, thank you, Andrew. Well, the short answer is I don't know, but I'll say what I do know. I'm involved with the Arctic Council with CAF, and there's a circumpolar biodiversity monitoring group that looks at marine mammals. And we do have a Russian participant, but I don't think they're that close to what's actually going on. I was happy to see with the case of the ringed and bearded seal modeling that Patrick Farnell was able to model Russian habitat as well. And it did seem that the seals would do better there in the future. So it's really an important area to get a handle on. I mean, my thinking is that Canada's Arctic archipelago and then the northern part of Greenland are really key as far as the last ice area in the future. But there's a lot of possibilities in Russia as well, and it really would be important to know more and to maybe work more in that area.
Amanda?
Yeah, hello. I really enjoyed that as well. I don't work in the polar regions at all, but it was fascinating. It made me wonder a little bit about whether you're seeing similar variable life history according to core or more distant zones in the Antarctic, where you have very different land masses, very different, and maybe even much more similar, sort of continuous habitat rather than this very broken habitat in the Arctic. Do you know anything about whether the Antarctic also has these quite different life histories?
Yeah, no, it's not a field I'm not aware of, but I think the Antarctic still has that nice latitudinal gradient, and you still have. I'm thinking in the case of seal species, they do exist on islands. For example, the otterids at lower latitudes and also at higher latitudes. So there likely would be some of those differences. That would be cool to look at.
Steve, thank you so much for your talk. I really enjoyed that. I had a question regarding some of the communities you work with and whether it has generated sort of like different dynamics in terms of partnerships or collaborations because they're witnessing unprecedented changes in terms of potential management in the future.
Yeah, that's the one thing I've noticed is that the response by communities around the circumpolar Arctic are quite different and variable, and not only spatially, but temporally. We've, I think, seen a much more collaborative relationship, for example, with the federal government and the Inuit living in the territories in Canada more recently, whereas when I started, I think it was much more combative. But this seems to be shifting with different regions, and Greenland now seems to be, they're going through a phase where they want to have independence, and there's some dynamics there related to their to the country that's been kind of running them for a while in Denmark, and then in Alaska we get situation where the Inupiat are starting to assert themselves politically, and and it's becoming a little bit more challenging, I could say, for researchers in science to work there. But again, I think it's more of a case of transferring that expertise to them so that they can run the science themselves and get some of the answers. But yeah, I do see variation, both changes over time and also space. The circumpolar Inuit, I guess, are becoming much more politically strong, and it's wonderful to see because they exert such a strong desire to keep their homeland safe and operating well, and they can probably do it better than any other human group. So that's a good thing. Looking forward to the future. Yeah, I don't know if that helps answer your question.
It looks like we have a question in the room.
Okay. Hi, Dr. Ferguson. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. Thank you so much for your talk. It was really interesting. I had another question about the different groups, groups of belugas and seals that are in the core versus the southern range. You mentioned these very different life histories, different speeds of reproduction and seasonality. And I was wondering if people think that that is kind of like a sign of local adaptation in some of the southern range, or if they moved there more recently and there's been like a more recent divergence of these traits and life histories, or whether that's like a reflection of different diets and different thermal pressures.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that it's probably a combination of those things. That's a species adaptations to a certain habitat means that it can't live everywhere. There has to be an edge to their distribution. But when you look at something like the landscape and the seascape of, say, the Canadian Arctic, there's areas like Hudson Bay where it's a sea. They're kind of trapped. So you can't. It's not an open area for them to move about in necessarily. So there's going to be restrictions relative to the different habitats. I think in some ways they can become adapted to different areas, and this is what evolution does. It's you can also get different populations adapted to different things. Thinking again with the case of the ring seals, we have the Sami ring seals in Lake Lagoda, and places where seals have adapted to fresh water or to really isolated areas. So yeah, that evolution does happen both sympatrically and allopatrically.
I have a question. I was really surprised about when you compare the seals from the high Arctic and the core and the lower, that there is more seasonality in the Arctic seals, the blubber fat, I think it was, than in non-Arctic seals. For me, I was surprised by the seasonal oscillation that was more evident in the non-Arctic seals, considering that in Arctic is highly, there's this strong seasonality, right, in ice coverage and prey availability. So I was wondering, if you have evidence for that for other marine mammals like cetaceans. I know it's a bit more difficult to get to this type of data for cetaceans, but and also how it could be, if there is any evidence for adaptation or what it means for animals that have different foraging strategies, like those that are forage in the pelagic in comparison to those that forage in the benthic ecosystem, in terms of the seasonality in prey availability and also in potential warming, increasing temperatures, how they could adapt to those changes. If there are species, depending on their foraging strategy, they would be able to adapt with more easily or not. If you can talk on that a little bit.
Yeah, if I understand, I think it's as far as other species that might show this pattern. Yeah, I'm not familiar. The seals are such an ideal marine mammal to do this kind of research with, both because of the number of samples and availability of samples seasonally. But it likely occurs elsewhere. I think it's a bit you see how fat some of the seals are in the southern areas, and you think, well, they're great shape. But I think there's also been evidence that this creates problems for them, that they sometimes don't molt properly and can get evidence of disease, and they can act behaviorally strangely, which could be related to hyperthermia, and so they're might be predisposed to early mortality that way. Some of the seals in Hudson Bay in 2010 were seen crawling up on shore to get out of the water, and polar bears could easily pick them off since they were waiting on the shore. As far as the whales go and their adaptations, it's a little harder. I think beluga whales are one that we could do that kind of a comparison, because there's quite a few populations around the world, and they do exist in a really strong environmental gradients. You'd have to, because some of these whale species are long-lived, you'd have to really consider almost an evolutionary time that's quite protracted. So changes don't happen that quickly. But they are physiologically adapted to variation, I think. This is something that's been common in their history. And so they would, again and again, we've seen different foraging strategies by different whales in different areas, so that they seem quite flexible and adaptable in that sense. I think it's other things that'll give them problems, and maybe not food.
Hi, Steve. So I have a question about the length of whaling that you talked about with the bowhead whales. And my understanding from your explanation is that it wasn't so much the proportion of the population that was whaled, but the actual length of the whaling that mattered in terms of where was the carrying capacity post whaling. And I was wondering what you think is the mechanism. And I guess the only thing I could think of is kind of related to fish, but I don't think it would work with whales. But so with fish, we know that a lot of fisheries select the bigger fish, which makes that kind of selection pushes to have smaller fish in the population that reproduce less, and that will affect the R naught. But I can't see this being happening with the bowhead whale. So what would be the mechanism for this change in carrying capacity due to length of whaling?
Yeah, I think it's going to be speculative, but here we go. I think the whole ecosystem evolves with the whales. And so we have these high latitude areas, and this has been shown more clearly in the Antarctic, where the whales have developed through their excrement and through their feeding are fertilizing the oceans. And this cycle can continue long enough through evolution that, and by evolution, I'm talking here hundreds of thousands of years probably, you can build up actually an ecosystem with a higher productivity, greater species diversity, greater overall diversity. But if you knock it back and you take that key component out, the mysticetes, the baleen whales, and you remove them for, let's say, hundreds of years, then all of a sudden you've got this cascade with the zooplankton readjusting, all these other things. And now we're back in a situation where we might have to wait another, so many hundreds of thousands of years for the ecosystem to evolve to that higher productivity level that it was at. So that's just an idea of what might be going on. I don't know how else to explain it.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Steve, for this really nice talk, and thank you, everyone, for being here. I would like to thank Steve on behalf of the Institute for the Oceans and Fisheries for his presentation.